This is the Pandemic Baseball Book Club podcast. I'm Dave Jordan, the co-author of the upcoming Dave Parker memoir, COBRA, and I'm here with Lincoln Mitchell. Lincoln is a political analyst, pundit, and writer based in New York City and San Francisco, a native of the Bay Area and Giants fan since the mid-1970s. He's an adjunct research scholar at Columbia University's Arnold A. Salzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the author of 5 books. Most recently, San Francisco Year Zero, Political Upheaval, Punk Rock, and a third-place baseball team. Today, we are discussing the Giants and their city, Major League Baseball in San Francisco, 1976 to 1992, among a few other fun tangents. Welcome to the show, Lincoln.
Thank you for having me on. This book, by the way, comes out next week. March 2nd is the release date. So
perfect. And I've I really enjoyed it. I spent last weekend going through it, and I couldn't get enough of it. And we have so much in common, and we have for a number of years since I co-authored Fastball John from the great rookie pitcher of the year, John D'Acquisto in 1974 with the Giants, and we cross paths so often in terms of the research and talking about the team, and it was great to kind of speak with you about these things and things that I've noticed and things that you've discussed in many of your books related to the Giants. But the one thing that popped out at me to begin with, I was looking at the attendance numbers for the San Francisco Giants in the late 60s and the early 70s. The interesting thing that I've always been curious about, after working on Fastball John, was the lack of attendance for Bay Area baseball in the during the 1970s. I mean, you even look at Oakland A's. I mean, a seemingly historic dynasty team. In 1971, they won the AL West. They were 7th out of 12 teams in attendance. 72, they win the World Series in 7 games against the Cincinnati Reds. They're 7th in attendance. 73, they win the World Series against the Mets, 5th in attendance, they're 8th in attendance. I'm sorry. And in 74, out of 12 teams in the American League, the Oakland A's win their 3rd series in a row. They're 11th out of 12 teams in attendance. And the Giants weren't much better. 72, they were last in attendance. 73, they came in 3rd place. They were 10th in attendance. 74, 75, and 76, they were last in attendance in the National League, where your book begins.
Right.
What do you account for that? Well,
you're kind of understating how dire this was, right? In the early 1970s, that A's team had 3 future Hall of Famers on the roster, and at least one other player, Burke, for whom a very good Hall of Fame case could be made. They had some really exciting, dynamic, and great players. The Giants, for the first part of the decade, had 4 no questions asked Hall of Famers. Mays, McCovey, Juan Marshall, Gaylord Perry for some of that time, and some very, very exciting players around them, like Bobby Bonds, for example. I think there are a couple of variables here, 3 really. One, until very recently, and maybe even still, it was understood, just a given, that this market was not big enough for 2 teams. And as soon as the A's got there, it became very difficult for the Giants. Also, the A's were very good too, so that also made it difficult for the Giants. That's one thing. If you look at the areas that had two teams then, the markets, Southern California, New York and Chicago were all bigger in population than the Bay Area. Right. Second, there was a lot going on in the Bay Area in the early 1970s, throughout the 1970s, and baseball was really seen by a lot of people as some kind of old, conventional, even conservative thing, which it was at the time, institutionally. Right. So it wasn't the people that were coming to the Bay Area. They didn't always bring their passion for baseball with them, or they weren't people who had a passion for baseball. And if so, they had it for another team, the Phillies or the Mets or the Yankees or something. Yes. And the third thing is that the Oakland Coliseum, where the A's played, the only reason we don't read it so much about what a terrible ballpark it was is because Candlestick was worse. But these 2 teams played in absolutely terrible ballparks. Yes. And the A's are still, to this day, they're finally, putting up blueprints and plans for the new downtown ballpark if it happens in Oakland, which would be great. But for the Giants, beginning around the time my book starts, my book covers the period, basically January of 76 to December of 1992.
Yep.
It begins with the team leaving for Toronto and then getting saved at the last minute, and ends with the team leaving for Tampa and being saved at the last minute. But throughout this whole period, 2 years didn't go by where weren't where the Giants were leaving. Mm-hmm. And that was because of this just terrible attendance. And we can talk more about Candlestick Park, because I think that's probably the major character in this book.
It really is. It really is. And I know we'll definitely be getting to that at some point. It was like, let's look at, the 76 Giants for a moment. I mean, they lose 88 games. Their pitching staff was so much better than the record indicated. I mean, you have Montefusco, the Count, Ed Alicki, and Mike Caldwell, the 1-7 Mike Caldwell. He had the fielding independent pitching stat, FIP, where it's just strikeouts, home runs, hit by pitch, and walks. He had a FIP under 3, which is pretty outstanding. And was it just their bad defense and I guess lack of offense?
Well, that 76 team's hitting was really bad. I mean, and the Count was still an elite pitcher. He had some arm injuries later. He was an elite pitcher. The bullpen was always very strong throughout this period. Mm-hmm. But the hitting was terrible. I mean, the hitting stars on that team were Bobby Mercer and Gary Matthews. And Bobby Mercer just hated playing with the Giants. I mean, Mike Murphy, the clubhouse man during that time, who's still there now, he's kind of the clubhouse man emeritus now with the Giants. Right. He told me that Bobby Mercer would come in and say, "Can we blow this place up?" He just hate. Now, Candlestick Park, on a nice day, was a pitcher's park. It was big, yes, with a fair amount of foul territory. Mm-hmm. When you add in the wind, I mean, you're coming to bat. There's whirlwinds of peanut shells and hot dog wrappers blowing around at your feet, sometimes at your eyes. It's freezing, and now you got to bat against, a major league pitcher. So it was a pitcher's park, and it was just kind of a lousy team on the field. They had, Von Joshua in center field, Daryl Thomas and Rob Andrews. Both of them were useful players. Neither of them could do much, really help you. Chris Spire, Chris Spire started out as kind of an intriguing player. You thought this guy was going to be a real star. A couple of times, all-star team in the early 70s.
Started the 73 game, yeah.
And then by the mid-70s, he's kind of gotten to this place where he's a solid but unspectacular player. The one trade they made was in that offseason, and we can get, because that 75-76 offseason is fascinating, was to pick up Ken Reitz, who, I think for Pete Falcone, who just was a solid fielder who could not hit at third base. The Giants really, outside of one good year from Dick Dietz around 1970-71, in that period he was pretty good, until Buster Posey, never had catching. I mean, Wes Anderson is probably the franchise's best catcher pre-Buster Posey. So this whole period, get a couple of years out of Bob Brenly. But so they just got offense from nowhere. The defense was okay, but not great. And the pitching just couldn't carry that team. And there were some good teams in the NL West in the 70s.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And it's funny, when we'll talk about it later, more the all-time team for this era, you couldn't find a reasonable catcher. I mean, there's an argument for all of them for one really bad reason.
Right. Brenly stands out, but Terry Kennedy was useful for a couple of years. Gary Carter, just the end of this era, becomes very, and it's been an odd, for a team that has, I mean, think of it this way. You want to go through Giants history at first base. I don't know that Bill Terry cracks the top 5, right? I mean, he probably does, but probably at 4th behind McCovey, Cepeda, Johnny Mize, Bill Terry. But I think Will Clark is probably a better player than Bill Terry. I mean, I know the old timers don't want to hear that. So they've been, center field, it doesn't matter who you have else. If you had Willie Mays, you've had the greatest center fielder of all time.
Of course.
And there have been some positions, and they've had some fantastic pitching.
Yeah.
In some positions where they've been historically quite weak. Shortstop until, really, Brandon Crawford might be the best shortstop other than Travis Jackson in Giants history. Yeah.
I mean, the default answer has got to be, for this era, it's got to be Uribe,
But that's the tallest building. I mean, or a year and a half of Chris Spire. I mean, and there's a whole one. I mean, the Johnny LeMaster experiment was, and there are people who still defend Johnny LeMaster, but this grounds of he was the only evidence that Johnny LeMaster was a standout defender was that he couldn't hit. So you end up saying, why is he in the lineup? And then there's this very odd situation where in 1983, they start batting him leadoff. I know we're kind of skipping all over.
Yeah, that's right.
Start batting him leadoff. And if you were in San Francisco at the time, I was a high school student, a pretty big Giants fan at the time. Mm-hmm. There was this almost media campaign to make the fans think that this guy with like a 280 on base percentage was a leadoff hitter. And he just absolutely wasn't.
Yeah.
But he kept him around for a very long time. Uribe was a very solid defender. Couldn't do much with the bat, but by the time he came along, by the late 80s, he wasn't asked to do much with the bat. They had some good hitting, and he was very solid defense, and he helped that team a lot. But, you know, would you be excited about starting the season with Jose Uribe? You'd be fine with it. You wouldn't be excited about it.
Yeah, definitely. You know, it's funny going back to the off season 76, 77. You know,
75, 76 or 76, 77?
No, 76, 77.
Yeah.
Talking about that, and in terms of free agency.
Yes.
You know, when you look at when you go back and you look at the great free agents and the great signings, people talk about Reggie Jackson. They talk about Bobby Grich going to California and having a solid career after his injuries in 77. They signed Donnie Baylor, they signed Joe Rudy, and but few people talk about the greatest, you know, dollar for dollar pickup of that free agent season was Willie McCovey.
For that 1 year. And I find that free agent, and I talked extensively with Bob Lurie about that that offseason.
Mm-hmm.
And he was fascinating because, you know, and Lurie, this book is about the Bob Lurie era in some part because Bob Lurie was just like, I went to talk about the book and he just took hours, and I can tell you funny stories about talking. He was a very interesting guy. Gave me like his personal files to go through at my leisure, you know, up in the Bay Area. He was in Palm Springs when I saw him. But he talked about how this was so new and they couldn't quite figure it out. And they had this thing called the re-entry draft where you'd actually draft which players. So they just, you know, Reggie Jackson, Raleigh Fingers, and these guys were never going to sign with the Giants. And you know, Finley's team, that great early 70s A's team, which was dismantled by free agency. Not Reggie was already with Baltimore by then, but, you know, Baylor, Rudy.
Yep.
They were all some of them were getting old anyway. Rudy was never really a great player after that. Bando had maybe one great year. And McCovey, nobody drafted him. And the day of the free agent draft, there's an article in the Chronicle, the San Francisco Chronicle, the major paper out there, saying Willie McCovey wants to come back to San Francisco.
Do you think the other teams might have known that?
I can't. Well, remember that this is early enough that teams aren't thinking strategically about designated hitters.
Yep. Okay.
And you know, the A's had tried him there, but 76 was the worst year of McCovey's career. But as recently as 75, he'd been a valuable hitter.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a team that expects to face some right-handed pitching, particularly if you play enough, you know, McCovey could do some damage still. But he may have made it clear that he wanted to come back. You know, Horace Stoneham, the kind of last years of the Stoneham era, you know, frankly, trading Willie Mays back to the Mets was a favor because he wanted to come back here. You know, it's a good way to end his career. They couldn't pay him what he deserved, what he was making. It was kind of an emeritus contract at that point. Yep. So I think that was part of it. And then when I asked Lurie, he very much said it was a baseball decision, but I think he was being gracious. And the truth is that it was a San Francisco decision. I mean, the team, you know, was still trying to find a post-Willie Mays identity.
Yes.
And a post-Willie Mays bond with the city. And Lurie, who was not Lurie is a very wealthy man, but he didn't come from, you know, he's an old style owner. He's a civic booster. He wants, and he's a Giants fan going back to when they moved there. Before that, he was a Seals fan. So he has deep roots and kind of, as not as a player, but in, you know, the San Francisco baseball culture. And I think he thought bringing McCovey back would help create some bonds. And it did. It really did. And then in 1977, he's comeback player of the year. And he's really the best hitter on the team at that point. And then he slumped 78 through 80. He was not as valuable a player. So but they weren't paying him all that much. And he was a better. I mean, what did Joe Rudy ever do for the Angels? Baylor had a couple, obviously some very good years, but you know, Sal Bando, it was a great signing.
Yeah. There were a lot of those free agents, especially a number of the guys from the A's, that it seemed like it was almost a payment for previous performance in so many of those.
And the owners had no idea how to know that. They didn't know how contracts worked. You know, they didn't think in terms of long-term contracts. They just, you know, they say, hey, we can get this shiny object. And they just knew so little about it. And a lot of players, I mean, think of a guy like Wayne Garland who signed like a $20 million, whatever that was, a $2 million.
He's always the poster boy. He's the poster boy.
For what, one decent year, you know, so. Yeah, but in today, you know, you wouldn't have given those contracts to those older former A's.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Do you think having McCovey there impeded Mike Ivey at all? I mean, Mike Ivey is just a perplexing dude overall. You know, getting signed by the Padres and then basically telling them, getting drafted by the Padres and basically telling them, I don't want to catch. I don't want to be a catcher.
And also he couldn't. I mean, he was not a good catcher.
Yeah.
Ivey, you know, Ivey was clearly wrestling with some serious psychological issues. And there was no structure in baseball to deal with that.
Hello.
Hello?
I'm right here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Okay, and there was no structure in baseball to address that.
Right.
By 1978, Ivey was clearly the better player.
Mm-hmm.
And, in that 1979, the Giants finished 6 games back, a third place team. Maybe if they go to Ivey full time, they finished 4 games. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
He probably, and for the first half of this book, between really 1976 and 1987, when the team's not all that, 86, that 11-year period, they don't win anything. The 2 biggest moments are Mike Ivey's grand slam in 78, early in the season, and Joe Morgan's 3-run home run the last day of the season, 82.
Right.
Ivey by 79 is starting, but McCovey's still getting a little too much, not too much because he's Willie McCovey, but it's very hard to displace a legend. And
Yes.
that was what Ivey was charged with doing. And then the Giants, kind of he retired, he unretired. They got kind of sick of him and they traded him in a very good trade. They got Dave Bergman, who was a, useful first baseman, and Jeffrey Leonard, who went on to be a real impact player for the Giants. But poor Mike Ivey, who's a right-handed power hitter with no speed, gets sent to Houston to play in the Astrodome. Like, no wonder. It was a career that just absolutely didn't work out for a guy who really could hit. I mean, particularly against left-handed pitching.
Yeah. Your last book, San Francisco, Year Zero, covered the 78 Giants in season in such great detail. I'm wondering how much of an impact leftover material played a part in deciding to jump right into this book.
Well, there were a few things in that first book that I really thought I wanted to dive into more. One was the Giants almost going to Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a fascinating story. And the one reason that was a fascinating story for me is that one of the main players in that is Mayor George Moscone.
Yes.
And this is, and I suspect that most people who are watching this or will listen to this, they know George Moscone as the other guy who was killed along with Harvey Milk.
Yeah.
And I'm in my non-baseball world, I'm writing a biography of George Moscone because he was actually an extremely influential and important person
Mm-hmm.
in San Francisco history and in California history. But he wins a extremely competitive mayor's race. I mean, really down to the wire. The man who loses, a John Barbagelato, is kind of this proto-Giuliani type. He insists the election was, to his grave, he insists the election was stolen. And the conservatives have embraced that. Jim Jones stole the election for George Moscone. It's not true, but a lot of conservatives believe that. And he comes in with his big plans for the city. And, on day one, the Giants are leaving. That the Chronicle announces that the Giants are going to Toronto. Not that they might go, not that there are talks, but that they are going to Toronto the day before Moscone is sworn in.
Wow.
So that's fascinating. So it takes over that. And then from the baseball perspective, I have this kind of this is not the title of the book, but in my mind, there's this era in Giants history, which I call between the Bonzes, from the time they trade Bobby till the time they sign Barry, which is the most overlooked period in Giants history.
Right.
But it's also, for me, the part with which I'm most familiar. And it kind of dovetails with the period in San Francisco where, you missed the summer of love and you weren't there for the tech boom, right? So, you didn't see the Jefferson airplane in 1967, but you saw the dead Kennedys, and no one cares about the dead Kennedys because, the boomers have such, remember in San Francisco, the 60s lasted well into the 80s. So I wanted to kind of really probe this period in Giants history where so much happened. Just the kind of off the field baseball strike, the birth of free agency, the strike, collusion, the team constantly leaving the city and not leaving the city, which is a fascinating story of San Francisco politics. And then there are a lot of good baseball stories. And really, and again, the character of Candlestick Park, this is when Candlestick Park is kind of constantly, everyone knows it's not good enough. And then there's this wonderful moment in the book, and I talk about it, where they finally make it back to the World Series. The first time in 27 years, which for a team like the Giants, I mean, there are a lot of baseball fans. I remember in 2010 when they won the World Series finally, people in New York were shocked to learn they had never won before in San Francisco. Casual baseball fans just assume, well, they had Mays and McCovey, and they must have won one of those years. They finally make it back to the World Series, the first game in San Francisco at the Stick since 1962, and what happens? An earthquake, right? Like the most San Francisco stroke of bad luck you can happen, an earthquake. And what happens at Candlestick Park? Basically nothing. No one is hurt. Nothing falls down. the stadium holds up. So this place that's become a joke and an insult, and we can never play baseball here, I mean, 49er fans might argue with this, but I think this is Candlestick Park's finest. I'm a 49er fan too, but this is Candlestick Park's finest moment. And then the backstory is that Mayor Feinstein, who's now Senator Feinstein, but for San Francisco, she's always mayor. The mayor, she in like the early 80s decides to put some very small amount of money into retrofitting the stick. And everyone just says, well, no, like why? The Giants, no one ever sells out. But the 49ers are good. Maybe there's a playoff game. And that really saved some lives. So it's a fascinating period in history. And lastly, I think it's interesting. You know, the baseball stories about, you know, the Yankees during the 50s, right? Or the Dodgers during the Boys of Summer era. Or, you know, but to be a fan of a team that's not very good for a long time is how many people experience loving baseball. Yeah. And, you know, I'm not a Chicago White Sox fan, but I'm sure if you were, you could find a 15-year history in White Sox, you know, period in White Sox history that's fascinating. A lot of characters. They don't really win anything, but it's still kind of fun to write about.
Throw Bill Veeck in there, you know, the short shorts. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Chet Lemon, you know, Ralph Garr, all these people. So that's kind of how I got to the idea for the book.
That's very cool. And, you know, it's so funny because I'm going through it and I'm going past the 78 chapter and the 79 chapter. And something struck me that, oh, wow, Vida Blue and Billy North, the last two A's of the left on the roster from the dynasty, end up as San Francisco Giants at the same time.
Well, Blue gets there earlier.
Yep.
Right. And let's just say this. I asked Vida Blue to contrast the experience of playing in Oakland with the A's and with San Francisco. And let's just say this. He compared the experience of playing for Bob Lurie was much, much better for Vida Blue than the experience of playing for Charlie Finley. And I'm sure that he communicated that to Billy North. Yep. And North had a very good, and North is, I was actually thinking about Billy North recently because I think there's an unfair story that's told about Billy North, which is that he's traded for Glenn Burke and the Dodgers dumped Glenn Burke, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure the Dodgers win that 78 division if they don't make that trade. Bill North was a really good player. He had limited skill set. He couldn't hit a power at all. But he was a very, very good leadoff hitter, a very good top of the order kind of guy. And the Giants picked him up after the 78 season where they make a run. And I guess he has that kind of air of kind of a veteran who's won some championships.
Yes.
But the problem is they don't need a leadoff hitter. They had Bill Madlock, who turned in a great year as a leadoff spot and would have been a great leadoff hitter, but he ended up kind of clashing with management stuff. What they needed was a catcher or a shortstop who could hit even a little bit, you know, maybe another starting pitcher. But he comes over, he has a very good 79, and then his career kind of winds down. But it is kind of funny that they end up. There are also two African-American guys, you know, who stayed in the Bay Area. And that's an interesting story too. And Blue's story with the Giants, I mean, the day of the trade, you know, it's just the headline of the Chronicle is Giants get Vida because there's only one Vida in baseball,
of course,
particularly in the Bay Area. And he electrifies that team. And he really kind of gets San Francisco and the fans absolutely love him. And he comes in with 3 World Series rings, which is 3 more than anyone else on that team had when he got there. Yeah. And he stayed there for a while and he came back and ended his career with the Giants.
Yep.
You know, another phase, and we can talk about that because he played for a lot of different Giants managers and had a lot of different perspectives on each of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there were some real characters on that 79 team. You know, obviously since I've been, you know, dealing with Parker for the last 18 months, I've had done a lot of research on guys like Bill Madlock. What do you remember him like during his time with San Francisco?
Well, I remember that people were livid when he was traded. Mm-hmm. They were not happy about that. And I know there were some issues, but it was not a good trade. Mm-hmm. It was a good trade for Dave Parker and a Pirates fan, but it's not a good trade if you're a Giants fan. What made Madlock such, I think, really impressed Giants fans is that he changed positions.
Yes.
Bill Madlock was kind of an all-star third baseman, 2 batting titles, a very, very good player. And Darrell Evans, who on the balance probably a better player than Bill Madlock, if we, you know, again, the more quantitative stuff, but was not viewed that way at the time at all. No. And could play first base, but they hadn't McCovey by then. And Evans is out in left field where he's really not a great place for Darrell Evans.
Yep.
And they want to get all the bats in the lineup. And he started until the end of 1977, the very end of 77, he never played at second base. And he was not going to make anybody forget Frank White out there.
No.
But he could play it well enough. So he changed positions, and then he changed spots in the batting order.
Right.
You think of Bill Madlock as a middle of the order type hitter. He becomes a leadoff hitter. And in 1978, he may have been the best second baseman, other than Joe Morgan, who was always the best second baseman, but he may have been the second best second baseman in the National League. And so I think that really made Giants fans love him. And also, this is the period, the Giants and their farm system is developing outfielders. There's three guys in that. I was discussing with someone at one point in the 70s, the Giants had an outfield of all next Willie Mayses: Gary Matthews, Gary Maddox, and Bobby Bonds.
Yep.
And the Bonds for Mercer trade, which is this, a one-on-one kind of, trade of two guys, the next Mickey Mantle for the next Willie Mays. It's a huge trade, and it worked out for neither team. Except that the Yankees trade Bonds for Rivers and Figueroa, without which they don't win in 77, 78, those two World Series. And the Giants trade Mercer for Bill Madlock, without which 78's a disaster. So it works out. So the Giants fans, we dumped Bobby Mercer and got this guy, two-time batting champion. So he was really popular. He wasn't a guy like Blue. He didn't have the outsized personality of a Vida Blue. No. And he didn't have the kind of the goofiness, and I'm being charitable because I always liked him, but the goofiness of a Jack Clark. Yep. And remember, in that 77 to 1980 period, there's one leader on the Giants, and he doesn't have to say a word. Yep. And that's Willie McCovey. And everyone respected that. And people like Vida Blue, obviously, sadly, I couldn't interview Willie McCovey because he passed away before I started writing the book. But, guys like Vida Blue really talked about just how decent he was. And they refer to the term like gentle giant was it. And if you saw Willie McCovey, now a guy who's 6'4", 210 probably isn't big enough to play first base in the major leagues. But then he was this kind of huge figure and a larger-than-life figure. And, George Moscone, in his last year of life, in 77, I think, when they're trying to get a write-in candidacy for Willie McCovey to be on the All-Star team. Yep. And Moscone refers to him as a San Francisco institution like the cable cars or the Golden Gate Bridge, and he's kind of right. Yeah. That's, it's... it was really, really kind of crazy how that all worked out with that trade and with everything. Here's the fascinating stat that I found related to Billy North. 1980, he 500 plate appearances, 128 games, steals 45 bases, 1 triple. Yeah, I mean, Bill North didn't hit the ball that hard. He was. Like I said, he was a valuable player if you knew what to expect from him, but he didn't. But and he, he fielded his position well. He was, we don't have those kind of leadoff hitters anymore. There are fewer of them. The Yankees lead off with DJ LeMahieu, who's a very good player, but that's the numbers of some people who should be bad. Typically he's more of a number 3 hitter, the way LeMahieu hits now. But teams were expected to have, a fast center fielder who could bat leadoff. Is Billy North and Mickey Rivers very similar players? Omar Moreno, faster, not quite as good strike zone discipline. Miguel Delaney for a shorter period had that skill set. Yeah. And that was Billy North. He didn't hit the ball hard, but he could play the game and he could, draw the walk, but it was the right answer to the wrong question to bring him to the Yeah. It's funny, you bring up Jack Clark and you look at Darrell Evans and later in Clark's career, he became something of a walks machine. And now that, so many of the great baseball writers, whether it's Jay Jaffe or other sabermetric minded guys and folks, and you look at, was there any influence in your mind on Jack Clark from Darrell Evans? Not that I knew, but, McCovey, Clark, and Evans, who in the late 70s were kind of the center of the offense, were all high walk guys. Yes. And that may have been something the Giants were doing. I didn't ask that question. It's a very good question because they were all guys. Willie McCovey actually looks better now. You have trouble staying healthy, right? And the Giants had this, they had the problem of having both Willie McCovey and Orlando Cepeda at the same time, and neither of them could play the outfield, and they solved it by giving Cepeda away, as far as I can see. Yeah. But they had these, it was a walks and power that all three of those guys had. And McCovey, I was saying, McCovey all three of those guys, I think advanced quantitative analysis has made people appreciate how good they were.
Yes.
McCovey never hit for high batting average, but he led the league on base percentage once or twice, right?
Uh-huh.
Darrell Evans, clearly. And Clark, Clark was a great player who, until the very end of his career, was stuck in pitchers' ballparks. He had a reputation, but when I talked to a lot of players, the media, the reporters and stuff, they would say Clark just felt the Giants weren't doing enough to win.
Mm-hmm.
He was upset. They weren't putting good enough players around him, and he wasn't wrong. I mean, 1982, they make a run. 78, they make a run. And in neither year did they do anything during the season to get better.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a time when people did that already. The Dodgers upgraded during the 78 season. The Giants didn't really. They minor trades, but nothing substantial. And he just felt like didn't like playing on bad teams. And he didn't have a head for the game. Right. I mean, he would, on at least one occasion, he caught the ball with one out and tossed it to a fan and jogged in. But he could hit. And Vida Blue told me, he said, I would rather pitch to Mike Schmidt than Jack Clark.
Yeah.
And Mike Schmidt's one of the greatest power hitters ever, certainly of that era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. You bring up McCovey, and a lot of folks don't realize how amazing he was with his total, his total approach to hitting. Like 1973, the year he gets traded, he finishes. I've always been obsessed with his numbers in that year. He batted .266. His on base percentage was .420.
Yeah. He had a skill set that he had. McCovey. A couple things to know about McCovey. And I know we're spending a lot of time talking about him, but until 2000 or maybe 1990, he was more beloved in San Francisco than Willie Mays. For two reasons. One, he never played in New York.
Yep.
And New Yorkers always claimed Willie Mays in a way that made San Franciscans uncomfortable.
Yes.
Secondly, he came back. So McCovey's last year in San Francisco was 1980. His first year was 59. Mays's was 58 to 73. So there's a generation of fans who are now, in their early 50s or so, like me, who never saw Mays, but who saw McCovey. And that's the connection.
Yes.
Right. So
that's why his connection's so big at Pac Bell, AT&T, Oracle Park.
Right. Because he really, and the second thing is, he and Willie Mays were very different kinds of players. Mm-hmm. Mays is a five tools player. McCovey is essentially a power and patience guy, but he's really good at those. He was really good at those two things.
Yep.
But he was never going to, but he was not only the second best player on his team for that, pretty much the whole time Mays was there. He was the second best player from Alabama.
Yep. Right.
And he was the second best player with his first name. And so Willie Mays casts a shadow over everyone else on the ball field, but really over Willie McCovey. Right. And, I was just thinking how people, will compare him to Willie's almost interchangeably with Willie Stargell. McCovey was a better player. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, Stargell, nothing away from Willie Stargell, and also McCovey only played 150 or more games, I think 4 times.
Yeah.
And that was injuries, but also the, platooning him, sticking him in the outfield. What the Giants should have done is traded, Cepeda for a top-notch middle infielder who could contribute, not for, an older pitcher who was kind of done.
Yeah. Stargell actually gets the short shrift on his outfield play, which was pretty exceptional left.
That's right. He was a better outfielder than McCovey for sure.
He was great there.
And when they traded him to the Padres, they got your friend Mike Caldwell. That's how Caldwell came to the Giants.
Yes, that's right. He was in the 73 trade. There's been dozens of books written on Willie Mays. I'm not sure, and I'm actually pretty sure of this. There was never a McCovey memoir.
No. And there never will be. I mean, there could somebody will write a McCovey biography. Mm-hmm. But it's tough because he didn't say all that much. He was a quiet kind of guy, and also, immortalized by Charles M. Schultz. But if that line drive in the last at about the 1962 World Series goes, 6 inches higher, he's got a walk-off single to win the World Series.
Yes.
Instead, he's got what he always said was the hardest hit ball he ever hit, but it's an out. So it's just kind of he's how do you describe a player as a bad luck player who's that good and is a first ballot Hall of Famer? But 62 after such a great World Series, 1-0, losing the final game, he's got to be. They're all thinking we'll be back.
Yeah.
They're back 9 years later, and it's almost like this kind of last roundup of the old guys. I mean, it's kind of very poignant. And of course, they get beaten by a better Pittsburgh team.
It was similar to the Tigers the following season with K-Line and
Right.
you know, those guys, Norm Cash and
Right. But except it was only 4 years, not.
Yeah.
And they actually won in '68. But so McCovey, I think, is in danger of being one of those players who gets forgotten outside of San Francisco, where he'll always be, Willie McCovey.
Yeah. So now we're talking 1980, and McCovey retires in 1980, and there's sort of a changing of the guard in that off season. They get rid of Bob Nepper. Count Montefiusco gets sent off to Atlanta. Halicki's been gone. Moffat's gone. I mean, does it feel like, where is that changing of the guard? Is it 1980? Is it 81? Is it 82?
78, they have almost this out of the blue, this very good year.
Mm-hmm.
79, essentially the pitching collapses.
Yes.
And then they begin the rebuild. But 80, there's this, 80 feels like a lost season. I mean, I must have gone to 30 games. It wasn't lost at the time, but it was directionless. The first half of 81 is also directionless. And then Frank Robinson's, who was a good manager sometimes. So from the split season in 81,
yep.
The second half of 81 through all of 82, the Giants are one of the best teams in baseball.
Yeah.
But it's a team that is really built on veterans. Reggie Smith, Joe Morgan, guys like that. So 82, they get knocked out of the playoffs the last game of the last weekend of the season.
Yeah.
But you have this feeling of, okay, where do we go here? Because and then they have this really painful 3-year rebuilding process.
I don't know why I was looking it up, but it was probably a month ago when I was looking up about Reggie Smith. I always wondered why he stopped playing in the major leagues, and I started reading about the Giants making inquiries into free agent Steve Garvey.
Oh yeah,
and that just ticked him off. And then he got an insane offer from Japan.
Yeah, that was a weird moment because nobody wanted them to sign Steve Garvey.
Mm-hmm.
Like nobody on the job, no one in San Francisco wanted Steve. Steve Garvey might still be the most hated player ever played. Deservedly so, right?
Right.
Nobody wanted him on the team. And they end up not getting him really because of Candlestick Park. I mean, both Lurie and Corey Bush, who was, I think, the senior vice president of the team at that time, told me that. They felt when they got to negotiating with a free agent, if they offered the same amount of money, if it was a hitter, they would lose. But signing Steve Garvey would have been terrible because, well, first, because it would have been Steve Garvey. But secondly, because the Giants turn around, when you ask the turning point is opening day 1986.
Mm-hmm.
And the player that is the turning point is Will Clark.
Yep.
And the idea of Steve Garvey keeping Will Clark in the minor leagues makes me kind of feel a little sick even now. So that was, but it does speak to this challenge that one of the problems the Giants had with free agency, it's another way that Candlestick Park, I mean, they were deep into negotiations for a trade for Rod Carew following the 78 season. And again, given the year Mike Ivey had in 79, it probably wouldn't have been a good trade for that 1 year. On the other hand, for the next few years, he was a much better player because Ivey had a great 79, but Carew just didn't want to switch leagues and then play in Candlestick Park.
Yes.
Right? So it was very tough for them, to negotiate. And that's why they get these guys who are veterans. A lot of these people were people, I mean, that Frank Robinson really wanted or who wanted to play for Frank Robinson. Mm-hmm. Oddly enough, one player who fits this category that you wouldn't think of is Dwayne Kuiper, who's now kind of a legendary announcer in San Francisco, and he's quite good. And I spoke to him for this book, and he had a lot of thoughts, but he said he was not happy when he was traded from Cleveland because he's from the Midwest, from Wisconsin, to San Francisco. But he said, I was happy to be going to play with Frank Robinson, and then I think Lurie told me that the trade was made because he said, I want Dwayne Kuiper. I want that guy. And they said, you already have Joe Morgan playing second base. It was much better. I mean, Kuiper could field. He had no power. Yeah. And they said, well, I want him on the team. So he liked the veterans. But by 83, that just starts making sense because, the veterans are keeping whatever prospects they do have, they're keeping them on the bench. The minor league system, other than Chili Davis and Bob Brenly, is producing nothing. And the bottom falls out for 3 years.
Oh, God. You talked about, Bill North for Glenn Burke swap, and obviously Burke's a bit back in the zeitgeist somewhat right now, but He bolted from the Ogden team in the A's minor leagues in 1980, I believe. Was there any idea or any thought, you think, that maybe he could have approached the Giants, or I don't know? It's just that I'm just curious about that. I'm just riffing kind of, but
That's I will. There was one. The role that Glenn Burke plays in this book is that after the Giants almost moved to Toronto and finally make it to stay in San Francisco, he pinch hit in the last. He was the last batter in the first game at Candlestick Park in '76.
oh, wow.
And he got out. I don't know. I mean, Andrew Moranis has a new book out on Glenn Burke, which I look forward to reading. But I actually talked about this recently with someone who was close at the time, and he said Glenn Burke couldn't hit. And the homophobia that pushed Burke out of baseball, it wasn't bigotry that kept Burke from becoming the next Willie Mays.
Mm-hmm.
It was bigotry that kept Burke from having a solid career as a fourth outfielder.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are plenty of guys who played 10, 12 years in the majors hitting, with an OPS in the 90s, playing solid defense because he could field very well and running and stealing bases, and I think that for most teams at that time, having a gay player, given the moment where we were at that time, it wasn't worth it for a fourth outfielder.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the Giants ever really gave it any thought, but they didn't. He wouldn't have started on that Giants team in the 80s, right? In
pre-Chili Davis, 1980.
Well, Bill North's in center field, and he was a good. I mean, they already traded Bill North for Glenn Burke once. Like Bill North was in center field. Whitfield actually could still hit and left, and Jack Clark was Jack Clark. Now, could he have, gotten some playing time as a fourth outfielder? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was. I mean, the terrible break for Glenn Burke is that he gets traded to Oakland, which is a good. I mean, as much as it's clear the Dodgers got rid of him, one because they wanted Bill North, and two because of Lasorda.
Yeah.
Right? But he gets traded to Oakland, and then Billy Martin, who is a terrible, nasty guy, comes in.
Yeah.
And it's just brutal to him. And total, Martin was a bigot. Now, he's a complicated guy, but so that I think is a terrible break for Glenn.
Yeah, it was terrible luck for him, no doubt.
Because playing for a bad team in a small city in Oakland with a decent manager, he would have been fine.
He would have been fine. I grew up in New York City and in the New York area. I always believed that the metropolitan area, and I just wrote this down to, just have it set up properly, was generally divided on franchise rooting interest. Manhattan, the Bronx, North Jersey generally rooted for the Yankees. Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island was Mets country. What was it like in the Bay Area?
Okay, so San Francisco, the city where I lived, Giants. Okay, heading south, still Giants.
Right.
San Mateo, Santa Clara County. Once you get past that, it's just whoever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is then. Now it's all Giants. And that's why the Giants, when they were exploring leaving the city, were looking at San Mateo and Santa Clara County, because that was their fan base. And one of the reasons for that is that Candlestick Park is located in the southeastern corner of the city. Mm-hmm. So it's very convenient on the highways from those places. The East Bay, so across the Oakland Bay Bridge, Alameda, Contra Costa counties, A's fans. Right. Closer to Oakland, A's fans. The battleground kind of was Marin. Like that's where if you met someone from Marin County, which is just directly north of San Francisco, it wasn't quite sure. My one very close friend from Marin was a Giants fan, but that's not exactly a large statistical sample.
Yeah.
But that's the geography of the Bay Area. And now Marin is pretty much Giants country. I mean, the Giants, beginning in the later half of this period, really begin to, particularly after 90. Well, beginning in the 90s, they begin to really promote themselves and become the major franchise. And remember, the 80s, when you asked the rooting, it was in the 80s, football may have been bigger than baseball in the Bay Area.
Yep.
Certainly the Niners were doing a lot better than the Giants. I mean, we would joke that, September would roll around. Who's going to win more games this month, the 49ers or the Giants?
Well, speaking of going to the ballpark and fan interest and whatnot, during those difficult Giants years, it seems like management, Lurie and whatnot, and they tried to reward certain fans in certain ways. Talk about some of the rewards that you mentioned in the book.
Well, the challenge, Larry Baer, who's senior executive of the Giants, told me the challenge is always to get how to get warm butts and cold seats at Candlestick Park, right?
Right.
And ironically, a winning baseball team didn't seem to have much to do with that, right? I mean, they did draw pretty well in '78, but the mid '80s, it's bad again. And part of that challenge is to recognize that San Francisco is a different kind of market for baseball.
Yep.
It's a different market for everything. And to build a brand that somehow captures the gestalt of a fantastic but unusual city. And if you look at today's recent years, Bruce Bochy, Hunter Pence, Tim Lincecum, Sergio Romo, beloved in San Francisco, you wear a shirt that says "I only look illegal" to a World Series parade in Texas, maybe gets a different response, right?
Right.
So they're trying to figure out how to do that. So they do a couple things which are, I think, just quite extraordinary. One is they bring in Guido Sarducci, the character from Saturday Night Live, just to do these completely whacked out commercials for the Giants, right? I mean, they're terrible. And they've got Guido Sarducci just rabbiting on nonsense on the local television stations about coming to Giants games. The other two promotions, which I really enjoyed, and I remember this, is they had somebody, they made up this whole fake campaign that they had polling data. All of it was nonsense. I mean, it was all in fun. And they had a crab known as the Crazy Crab. Now, of course, crab is part of the cuisine in San Francisco. I mean, if you keep kosher, I'm sorry, but you go down to Fisherman's Wharf, you get crabs. It's crab season. You go to the Vietnamese restaurants, the Chinese restaurants. Everyone in San Francisco, Cioppino on Christmas Eve, if you're Italian. I mean, everyone loves crab, right? In San Francisco. Today, at the ballpark, you go to center field to get a great crab sandwich. It's not so cheap, but it's worth it, right? So they get this guy to dress out in a crab costume and come and dance to just an idiotic sounding song on the foul line. And everyone boos him. Boo, boo. And that's the mascot. Now, this does capture the vibe of San Francisco. It really was quite clever. It wasn't clever enough to really draw fans. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to show, I'll get a prop here because I have one. Oh, I have several, but I keep one at my desk. They do this. I think this is 84. If you stay to the end of an extra inning game, mm-hmm. you get a quad de candlestick. And here's a quad de candlestick. And what this says in Latin is that's what they told me. I didn't take Latin in Catholic school, but I'm going to put that away later. I came, I saw, I survived. Because you got extra inning night game. It was so cold. Now, the problem with this promotion was that you don't schedule night games, right?
Yeah.
So you just happen to get one.
Right.
You don't schedule extra inning games. So you just happen to get one. But the idea was, that it became like how tough you were. I can make it through. And they only did it for a couple of years. But even now, when you go out there, you'll see older fans with the Giants hats with, 3 or 4 of these or even more, mm-hmm. On their hat as a symbol of, how hard they were.
Hardcores.
I don't know where all of them are, but I keep this one above my desk.
God. Explain to me what the Ballpark Express was.
So I don't, so if you go to Yankee Stadium, you get on the D train, or the B train, 4 train. You want to take the 7 train out to Flushing to see the Mets play, right?
Yeah.
The geography of San Francisco is complicated. It is a compact city by Western standards, but it also has highways going through parts of it.
Right.
The struggle to keep highways out of San Francisco is something you can read about in my next book, because I am writing about that. But in Candlestick Park was in the southeastern corner, and it was not well served by public transportation. So they created what was known as the Ballpark Express. And the idea behind the Ballpark Express was that it would pick you up in certain areas in the northern and central parts of the city and take you out to the game. You'd get a transfer. This is the old days, paper transfer.
Right.
Take you back again. The flaws in this system were, one, the drivers seemed to make up the fee differently every day. So you didn't know if you'd be paying 50 cents or $2, which when you have $8 in your pocket actually makes a difference, right?
Yeah, of course.
You're going to get a hot dog and a Coke at a game or just a hot dog, right? Because upper deck reserve seats were $3 for some of this time, and those were good seats.
Wow.
And it would stop, it wasn't always like clear where it would stop, but it was, you would get on it and it would just say, the one I got on was the corner of Clay and Van Ness in front of like what we call there a corner store, what New York is more like a bodega. And it just said on the front, Ballpark, right? Mm-hmm. Ballpark. And it was just a regular city bus that had been put on this route, and everybody would get on. And then, eventually they introduced a bus pass, which you let you ride for free sometimes. And you would just go out to the ball game And then you might wait 30 minutes, 40 minutes afterwards to get
Ah.
the Ballpark Express home. I mean, it was just, the city didn't have any money. They wanted to get fans out there, but it had, and also remember, this is California. It's not New York. Everyone drives.
Yeah.
Who's on the Ballpark Express? Kids, senior citizens, and people who can't afford a car. So it was just kind of a nutty crowd. I remember a lot of seniors and a lot of kids, and they did not mix. But that was Candlestick Park. I mean, it was a terrible place at night because it was just too cold. But it captured something about baseball in the 70s. The ballpark was almost always empty. The food was terrible. The crowd was kind of rowdy. It was that kind of a ballpark, which is not always what people associate with San Francisco. And it's certainly what you wouldn't associate with a new ballpark.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. You put a lot of effort in this book and some fantastic research into chronicling Prop W. Explain Prop W and, just and its relevance to the stick.
So there's two initiatives. There's Prop W and Prop P, right? So basically, Lurie comes along in 76, buys the Giants, and there's this sense of by 1980 or even by 1978, we got to do something at the ballpark because they're going to leave again because he can't magically get the attendance up. He can't magically make money here. They've got to do something about the ballpark. So there's one proposal to dome the ballpark, which is too expensive and not a good idea. So that they get rid of that idea. Then they decide. So the politics here are a little odd, but they decide that the solution is a downtown ballpark, and they spend years dancing around this idea. And the mayor for much of this time is Dianne Feinstein. And according to the people I spoke to on the Giants side, Feinstein's predecessor and successor were much more interested in getting a ballpark than Feinstein. Now, Feinstein is term limited out in 1987. She's preparing to run for governor, which she lost that race and became a senator. But she wants to do seen as doing something, right? So they put on the ballot Proposition W.
Right.
It's 1987. And this is for a ballpark in kind of 7th and Townsend, kind of like around Potrero Hill, if you know that area of San Francisco.
Okay.
And there is this super competitive mayoral election with a conservative Democrat named John Molinari, who was backed by Feinstein, and a very progressive Democrat named Art Agnos, who was not backed by Feinstein. And the politics in San Francisco are that building the ballpark is something that the more conservative voters want. And the more progressive voters are thinking, we got other things to worry about. We can't afford it, all of that. And they don't want to spend the money. Art Agnos, running as the progressive, comes out against the ballpark. Well, Agnos gets in a runoff with Molinari because you have to get 50%. He then drubs Molinari in the runoff, and the ballpark fails by a small margin. So now Agnos becomes mayor, and now he's got a problem. The Giants are going to lose. They're going to leave, right? And he can't have that happen. So he sits down with Lurie. Now, the interesting story about Art Agnos is that he's from Springfield, Massachusetts.
Yep.
So he was a Giants fan before anybody in San Francisco was because they had a minor league team there. He told stories to me about shining the shoes of the various minor league Giants players. He said the best tipper, by the way, was Felipe Alou. So he says to Lurie, we got to solve this problem, right? So this is where the story gets really, I think, just Byzantine San Francisco politics. They walk around the research, whatever the site location, and they get this site on the water in the south of Market area. And they look at it and they're talking about what the ballpark would be. And they propose it, they draw it out. And this time there's not a lot of public money going to the ballpark other than
right.
So Agnos gets it on the 1989 ballot. Now there's not a mayor's race on the ballot. There's not much on the ballot, which means it's lower turnout, which means that might not be good. But
right.
Of
course.
That's what it is. So, but they're working hard and they're trying to get this thing passed. And then a few things happen. One, the good news is the Giants are good in 1989. They're more than just good. They're really good.
Yeah.
And on October 9th, Will Clark hits, in my view, the second biggest hit in Giants history. Single up the middle, drives in 2 runs. The Giants are going to the World Series. Well, now, and this is a month before the election, the Giants are going to the World Series the month before we vote on a new ballpark. This is great, right?
Yeah.
We're going to get this new ballpark, and this is a great location, and a lot of Giants fans are excited about it. And Agnos is not in the business of giving breaks to corporate interests, right? That's not Art Agnos's political career, and everyone kind of trusts that this is this is a more progressive approach here. And then October 17th, the earthquake happens. And now people are, even though it's not necessarily, there is a sense of we have to rebuild the city. We don't have time for new ballparks. And then a few days later, they get swept out of the World Series. And they lose this by a hair, by a few thousand votes. And the question is always, would this have happened if it hadn't been for the earthquake? But to make matters worse, a guy named Greg Luckenbill up in Sacramento, who has this idea that if the Giants have to leave San Francisco, I can get him to come to Sacramento and be a hero. He owns the Sacramento Kings, the basketball team. He puts some money into a mailer to scare people about the earthquake. Like, you're going to build a ballpark. And Agnos goes ballistic. He has these people indicted. I don't know that they did anything criminal, but he goes nuts. And he's still to this day, like, he's still angry at these people for that. But that's where the ballpark, so that's why Proposition P loses. And now they've gone to the voters twice. They're 0 for 2. In the next couple of years, they go to the voters of Santa Clara County twice, and now they're 0 for 4. And that brings us to 1992, where they move to Tampa, except they don't.
Would Lurie have had a little more success if he added a little bit more in terms of like a percentage? I'm going to put up X amount in terms of, building the ballpark.
Well, let me just say the caveat is that the location for Proposition P in 89 is exactly where the ballpark is today. So the spot was known. There was a perception that Bob Lurie's money comes from real estate.
Yes.
And when we think of real estate in San Francisco, I think he sold most of his holdings. When we think of real estate in San Francisco now, but in the there were still empty warehouses that he owned and stuff. It wasn't obvious that how much this was all going to be worth. And Lurie, by this point, feels like, I've done enough. What better for worse? He feels like, I've done enough. This is a good deal. I get how much more money we can put up, but we're not asking for taxpayer money. So he kind of feels like I've done my bit. Remember, Lurie, the other side of his story is that as soon as Moscone is hit with this, and when he becomes mayor in early 76, Lurie calls right away and says, I'm in for half the money to buy the team. It cost $8 million. I'm in for $4 million. And that was really valuable because basically he was known enough in Major League Baseball that people liked and trusted him. And Moscone knew that he was not going to go fast when to leave to take the team out because he was a San Francisco guy. Yeah. So he felt like he'd stepped up at the right moment. And then he said, I spent hours calling all of my, so to speak, my rich friends. This is his, not my words, not his, but he's really tied into the business community. He's calling all his rich friends and he can't raise $4 million in like a month in San Francisco. Imagine if that's 40. You or I could raise $40 million in San Francisco right now. Not for us, but like to buy a baseball team. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And he just can't do it. So I think he's a little bit angry. He's angry at Prop W failing, and he feels like he's done enough. And that's why he turns down the peninsula. But, as to paraphrase Dionne Warwick, most San Franciscans do not, I guess it's Burke Bacharach, do not know the way to San Jose.
That's funny. So Lurie buys the team. We're just talking about Bob Lurie right now. He buys the team in 76 for $8 million. He sells it 92, approximately $120 million. So the lazy writer will say he made a profit, but there were those years in between where there were annual losses. Is there any accounting for how much he might have lost in that?
Well, remember, he bought it for $4 million. He bought half for $4 million. Bud Herseth rides him to last minute for the other $4 million in early 76. Right. And then the National League basically says, Herseth's a little nuts. We need you to buy him out. So he gives him $4.5 million. Right. So he's in for $8.5 million. He did fine. I think that over the years, could you have, I guess one can do better than that. I don't think he was losing enough money that it dug into what was ultimately a pretty nice profit. Mm-hmm. And the tax write-off for someone like Lurie,
oh my God,
is significant, especially in the real estate business where taxes and all that stuff is important. So he did fine. He also ended up at the end when the people who were buying, when the Bear and Peter McGowan really, when they were a few $1 million short and he ends up lending them the money. Yeah. Because the thing about Lurie is that I think towards the end he got a little bitter and a little upset because he just felt like he was getting nowhere in the Bay Area. But in his heart, he didn't want the team to go to Tampa. Yeah. And the reason for that is simple. Bob Lurie, to this day, the I mean, his father before him, they're major philanthropists. I mean, he's older now, he's in his 90s, but they're major parts of that kind of philanthropic civic culture, society culture, all that in San Francisco. He doesn't want to be the guy that let the team go to Florida.
Of course.
But he also feels like I don't want to keep playing everyone taking advantage of me.
Yeah.
And that's where he ends up. And they were going to Florida. I mean, that was a tough moment.
I love the Bud Selig 1992 quote that you had in there, that I had to make a judgment on behalf of baseball as to what to do with this great franchise. And that really makes me laugh. I wonder if 92 Selig and the Bud Selig who retired as commissioner in 2015 would have the same view in this matter.
Well, first of all, I didn't get that quote in 1992. I got that quote in like 2019, right? So
I know, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, Selig, I suspect, told me that for a couple of reasons. One, we know how the history played out. Why not be on the right side, right? I mean, he's spinning it. Secondly, Tampa's not a great market for a baseball team.
Mm-hmm.
And Selig may have known that.
Yeah.
And since Selig's came in as commissioner, there's been one franchise movement?
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, Major League Baseball doesn't like moving franchises.
No.
And Selig may have come to that view late in his tenure as commissioner. And also by 1990, you see, in 76, I think if the Giants leave San Francisco in the late 70s, it's a real blow.
Yeah.
So especially if they leave after the 78 season, which we talked about in a previous book. In 92, San Francisco doesn't need the Giants to be a big league town anymore.
Yep.
And then you're abandoning this kind of the city that is becoming hotter and hotter, even though there was a recession in 92. Yeah. So San Francisco is a little different in 92. And also there is, I mean, I'm not entirely, I'm a little subjective here. The Giants are a great historic franchise.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They're one of the most historic franchises. And it's not great to play in three cities. It does take some of the shine off that. And the challenge for Selig is his job is to maximize profits for owners. Yes. It was to maximize profit. There's no job anymore. That's the job of the commissioner. Right? We can say what we want, but that's the job of the commissioner. Part of how you do that is you have this delicate thing called baseball history.
Yes. And
you have to always manage that. You have to always present that in the way that will maximize. So we talk about Jackie Robinson, but we don't talk about the racism that kept him out, just as an example, right? So, I think that Selig is, and Selig, unlike, let's say this, I'll have to say this diplomatically, Selig's love for baseball is a lot more obvious than his successors.
Yes, there's no doubt about that.
And he does love the game. And I don't think he wants teams moving to three different franchises. I mean, I think he felt in his heart. And Bob Lurie made a lot of mistakes as owner of the Giants.
Mm-hmm.
Signing Rennie Stennett, for example, was a mistake. Signing off on the Jack Clark trade was a mistake.
Yes.
Letting Dave Bristol manage that team for even anything longer than 48 hours was a mistake. Right. Trading Bill Madlock for Ed Whitson. I could go on, right? Thinking Al Oliver could play first base rather than just signing Darrell Evans to a 2-year contract, right? He made a lot of mistakes. One thing he did really well was he was very good at building relationships around baseball. And Bud Selig, remember, Selig first arrives in baseball really as owner of the Brewers.
Yes.
And Selig is constantly pitching because I was critical of this at the time, and I remain critical, this small market narrative, right? Let's gang up on the Yankees, the Dodgers and a few other teams. And he seeks Lurie as an ally in that.
Mm-hmm. Now,
San Francisco's a medium-sized market, but the Bay Area is split with two teams and this and that. But Lurie built relationships with a lot of people because he learned his lesson. Because what happened in 76 was that he needed to buy time to shake out another $4.5 million. And they got an injunction order from a judge who basically is a local San Francisco guy, grew up in kind of the same Catholic school world as the mayor, even though he's a conservative Republican, and just does it basically as a San Francisco, right? But he wants to buy time from the owners, and he has to turn to, of all people, Walter O'Malley, because Walter O'Malley, who was very powerful, needs the Giants in San Francisco. He wants that rivalry. But in 76, so Lurie then as owner, he builds relationships. So when he needs, now Selig, at this point, I think Lurie's just happy to sell the team, but it was much better. Bob Lurie's legacy looks a lot better because that team still plays in San Francisco.
100%. And it's I'm thinking about different aspects. And by the way, I have about 3 pages in the Parker book about the Rennie Stennett free agency signing. It's just, and you'll see why when you read it. We talk a lot about that and the Madlock trade, obviously. But one other thing that we talked about a lot in the Parker book was actually the aspect of cable television in the 80s.
Yeah.
How it impacted, the league. And you talked a little bit about Giants vision.
Yeah.
And remember in New York, we had Sports Channel and how that it suddenly blossomed. You were no longer watching the Mets on Channel 9 and the Yankees on Channel 11. You turn around and there's MSG and there's Sports Channel. And you had, what do you remember about Giants vision?
Well, I don't remember much because I was in college at that point.
Okay.
But what happened was the Giants, for much of the late 70s and early 80s, were on Channel 2, which was KTVU, which is kind of back then, which would be the equivalent of Channel 11 for the Yankees.
Right.
That kind of a major local station.
Independent, sure.
Right. But they only would televise a few games a year.
Mm-hmm.
So you really, not like the Channel 11 you watch, it seemed like it was almost every Yankees game because I would be spending time in New York in the summer. But Channel 2, there wasn't. So you really couldn't access the team on television. And it was that kind of old view that, if you put the team on television, nobody would come to the ballpark.
Yep.
And that was wrong. So they moved to Spectacor and they moved to the Giants division. And I think that helped generate a broader interest because nobody would go to Candlestick Park just because they hadn't done it before. It was not a gateway drug into being a baseball fan.
Mm-hmm.
You had to go because like today in many cities, including San Francisco and including New York, it's not unusual for a tourist, particularly an American tourist, to go to the ballpark.
Yeah.
Right. It was very unusual to do that in Candlestick Park. And for a young kid to learning about baseball, to not give it to them on television. Now the Giants always had great radio announcers, so that helped. But that I think that was also how the game was changing and how more money was coming into the game over these years.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, just talking about you in general, I really enjoy reading your books because what you do is you make me fall into the rabbit hole, and regardless of whether it's baseball or politics, and I'm reading this, I'm reading about Mayor Feinstein's situation with the ballpark, and I just keep thinking, how did she get along with Barbara Boxer?
How did she get along with Barbara? Feinstein and Boxer are, they both elected to Senate at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Boxer had a little bit of a sliver of San Francisco, I believe, when she was in the House of Representatives. Mostly she was Marin County.
Yeah. Okay.
But it was part of San Francisco. And Boxer's much to the left of Feinstein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, frankly, kind of major cultural differences. I mean, I'm Jewish and I grew up out there. And in my mind, I'm talking about San Francisco, there are kind of 2 kinds of Jews in San Francisco in terms of their cultural background, not in terms of like politics or anything or
Sure.
religiosity, but when I was growing up, there were the Diane Feinstein Jews who'd been there for a long time,
mm-hmm.
who, didn't use any Yiddish in their language.
Yep.
For example, who, if you ask, the way I would say this, a Diane Feinstein Jew in San Francisco is somebody who, if you say, "Are you Jewish?" it's an essay question. Right? In New York, "Are you Jewish?" Yes, no, we move on. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But they were, and Bob Lurie comes out of that world too.
Yeah.
Barbara Boxer and Harvey Milk and my family and my mom, who are all, Milk's not alive, but all more or less the same. Milk's a little bit older, but Boxer and my mom are the same age. They all came from New York.
Okay.
Or other Herb Gold came from Cleveland, right? Other places. They're came from before that the shtetls of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, places like that. They had accents. They spoke Yiddish. They ate Jewish food. They were and their politics from a lot of the politicians were much to the left of people. So it's the clash between Feinstein and Boxer, the dynamic, because they got along, was cultural and political.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tangent. But Boxer was not deeply involved in ballpark politics.
Yeah. Because
she was just, she didn't get to Congress till later. And this was, and Feinstein, I'm always, whenever you have a politician who's been in office forever, you tend to remember the older version of them.
Yes.
So just to pick another historical example, people tend to remember Reagan towards the end of his time in office totally different than what Reagan as governor was like when he was this young, dynamic, good-looking guy. Politics aside, Feinstein as mayor Feinstein was a groundbreaking. She got to be mayor because of an assassination, but then she got elected 2 full terms on her own.
Mm-hmm.
Was the first woman, or the second woman elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, the first woman to be its president. She was a groundbreaking politician in San Francisco, and got that way by being smarter and better prepared than anyone else.
Yep.
So when she was mayor, I was too young to vote for her. I did not love her as a mayor, but she was very hands-on, very on top of things, but the ballpark just wasn't a focus because she kept it from being a crisis.
Yes.
As soon as Art Agnos got into office, it was a crisis. And, I think Agnos lost in 1991, and part of the thing that was against him was that there was a sense that you're losing the Giants. And that in a close race, that doesn't help. And Feinstein had never let that happen to her.
It's very cool. It was a tangent, but I was just reading that and I was just completely kind of curious. That just popped in my head. You mentioned earlier about Will Clark getting back to the baseball side of things, and how you believe that was kind of a turning point for the franchise. Another thing, as you spoke of that, and I saw a transaction the Giants made with the Mariners. Will Clark had participated in the USA Olympic team, and as you all know, if you collected 1985 Topps baseball cards, you knew Bill Swift was there too.
Right.
So, was there anything that you might have learned about the dynamic between those two once Swift got to San Francisco?
Oh, I never heard that. And Kevin Mitchell was he was not there for that long, but was kind of a larger than life figure for the Giants.
Of course. Yeah.
He wins the MVP, makes the one-handed catch, and is kind of, and his fans loved him. And so the only comment that really struck me at that was Dusty Baker.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I was not happy with the trade until I saw what I really got. I didn't know who these guys were. The trade that sent Mitchell to Seattle. Yes. But then once I saw these guys, he said, Baker had a very close relationship with Kevin Mitchell. He was kind of a mentor, as he was a mentor to Glenn Burke.
Right.
And he was not happy to see him go, but he realized it was. And of course, they went out and got another left fielder right after that. I can't remember his name. Something about 700 home. Barry Bonds. That was.
You wrote a lot about the 1985 game with Will Clark and the single, and I ended up going into the YouTube rabbit hole and watching the game, and Vin Scully and Tom Seaver as the color man. Where are you at that point? Or were you in college at that point?
I was in the upper deck in left field, upper deck, about 25 rows back.
Okay.
So of the 58,000 people there, probably 50,000 had better seats than me. I had just graduated from college.
Right.
And that was Yom Kippur. And I had told my boss, I was working for a political campaign. I said, I don't work on Jewish holidays. And they said, fine. But I knew I was a big, huge Giants fan.
Right.
They called me up a couple days later and they said, listen, we know that it's, it's a Jewish holiday, but we have, do you want tickets to the game? And I said, this is a true story. And I said, yes. And my next thought was, I have 2 friends who are like lifelong friends and huge Giants fans. I don't know which one to take. And they're John Machino and Charles Fracchia. You may know both of them. And then they said, oh, we have 3 tickets. And I said, oh, wow. I said, they said, all right, well, just come by, get them. So they weren't great seats. I'm sure they had better seats for like some of their more important clients and things like that. But they had them way up there. And Charles, John, and I went to the game. And to get into the real, because we were talking to get into real Fracchian Arcania here. In the early 80s, when Al Oliver was playing first base and we were kids, we would go to the beach in San Francisco to party on the weekends.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles Fracchia, who was a legendary San Francisco Giants fan,
yes,
had a annoying habit of sneaking up behind you. Now it's cold at the beach. This is San Francisco. It's not LA. It's like 45 degrees.
Yeah.
Pouring and saying, let's play World Series, and pouring a beer on your head.
Charles.
This is horrible. So we go to the game and I get a couple bottles of cheap champagne before the game and I put in a cooler in my pick-em-up truck. and John he came up from Santa Cruz for the game and we drive out there and the parking lot is just people just partying in the parking lot after they win that game.
Sure.
And so we're drinking a bottle of champagne. I'm not drinking so much because I got to drive. And I make eye contact with John, and he gets Charles in some conversation. It's not hard to get Charles in a conversation about the Giants. And I sneak up behind him with the second bottle of champagne, pour it on his head, and say, "Let's play World Series."
Oh, that's funny. That's funny stuff with Charles. So, yeah, I think that's probably a wrap. Lincoln, I really enjoyed this, and I really enjoyed the book. And then that, like I said, whenever I get into one of your books, I tend to just fall into let me read more, and definitely the Giants and their city will make you do that. And it's been a pleasure to really spend this time with you.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for the conversation.
No problem. So that wraps up this episode of the Pandemic Baseball Book Podcast. I'm Dave Jordan, and this is Lincoln Mitchell, and we will see you all soon.